Timothy Pitzen, a 6-year-old boy from Aurora, Illinois, vanished in May 2011 under highly unusual and tragic circumstances. Timothy was born on October 18, 2004, to James Pitzen and Amy Fry Pitzen. On the morning of May 11, 2011, Amy picked Timothy up from his elementary school in Aurora, Illinois. She told school officials there was a quote unquote family emergency, but no such emergency existed. Amy then took Timothy on a bizarre journey, visiting several verified locations over the next 3 days. Their first stop was the Brookfield Zoo in Brookfield, Illinois. Later, they visited Key Lime Cove Resort in Gurnee, Illinois, where they spent the night. The following day, they traveled to the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. Security footage from these locations shows Timothy appearing to be unharmed and in good spirits. On May 13th, Amy checked out of the resort alone. This was the last confirmed sighting of Timothy. After leaving the resort, Amy purchased stationery and mailed several letters to family members. That afternoon, she was seen at a grocery store in Rockford, Illinois, where she appeared calm. However, later that day, Amy was found expired in a motel room in Rockford from an apparent you-know-what. And yeah, sorry, I hate censorship too, but chances are you would have never seen my video if I included the actual word. Amy left behind a note stating that Timothy was safe and with people who would care for him. More cryptically, she also wrote that, quote, "He'll never be found." The investigation into Timothy's disappearance began immediately after Amy's body was discovered. Authorities found no trace of Timothy at the motel or in Amy's car, which was littered with small blood stains confirmed to be Timothy's. However, the stains were not significant enough to suggest he had been seriously harmed, and it was later determined that this was likely the result of a nosebleed prior to the abduction. Investigators also discovered that Amy had taken steps to conceal her tracks. For instance, her phone records showed that she had driven to several remote areas before her death, apparently in an attempt to ping cell towers there. Despite extensive searches in the areas she traveled, no meaningful evidence of Timothy's whereabouts was found. Over the years, law enforcement has pursued numerous leads, but most have ended in disappointment. One of the most publicized developments in the case occurred in April 2019, when a young man in Newport, Kentucky, claimed to be Timothy Pitzen. He told authorities he had escaped from captors who had held him for years. This claim initially raised hopes that Timothy had been found. However, DNA testing quickly revealed the individual was not Timothy, but a 23-year-old man named Brian Rinne with a history of criminal activities and deception. Notably, Rinne was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the hoax and the harm he inflicted on the Pitzen family. Numerous theories have been proposed regarding Timothy's disappearance. The most optimistic theory is that Amy gave Timothy to someone she trusted, as she claimed in her note. This would mean Timothy might still be alive, living under a different identity. However, skeptics argue that it would be nearly impossible to keep such an arrangement secret for so long, especially with the widespread publicity surrounding the case. That said, others argue that there are numerous cases of parental abductions where children live their life under an assumed identity for decades. Some theorize that Amy may have given Timothy to individuals who were under the belief that Timothy would be endangered if he was returned to his father. Another theory is that Amy may have ended Timothy, though there's no significant evidence to indicate this is the case. Others suggest that Amy might have left Timothy in a remote location where he succumbed to the elements. This theory aligns with the lack of physical evidence and the extensive but fruitless searches in the areas Amy visited. Further, it provides an alternative theory as to why she visited such remote locations. Perhaps she wasn't trying to ping cell towers to throw off investigators. Rather, perhaps she was looking for a location to drop the boy off where he would never be found. Notably, his father, James Pitzen, strongly believes his son's still alive. If he is, I have a feeling that one day Timothy will submit his DNA to a genetic testing agency and be in for the surprise of a lifetime. 17-year-old Kurt Sova lived at home with his parents in a working class neighborhood on the outskirts of Cleveland. He was a high school junior, the youngest of four brothers, and close with his mom and dad. According to his parents, Dorothy and Ken, Kurt wasn't the type to stir up trouble. He got along with neighbors, stayed out of trouble, and never caused problems at school. On Friday, October 23rd, 1981, Dorothy last saw her son in the late afternoon. He left the house and, just a block away, ran into his friend Sam. Sam mentioned a Halloween party scheduled for that evening, and the two boys decided to drop by. Kurt never returned home. Dorothy later recalled that Kurt rarely stayed out late without permission. If he was not home by 10 or 11 p.m., his parents always knew where he was. But that Friday, he simply vanished. By Saturday morning, worry had set in. Dorothy started calling Kurt's friends, while his father, Ken, searched familiar neighborhoods and hangouts, hoping to spot his son. As the hours passed with no sign of Kurt, their concern deepened. On Sunday, they filed a missing person report with the Cleveland police. Dorothy and her other sons blanketed the neighborhood with missing person flyers. Friends and family combed ravines, schoolyards, and even dumpsters, determined to find Kurt. Later that Sunday, Dorothy uncovered a potential lead. Kurt had supposedly attended a party in nearby Newburgh Heights on Friday night, less than 2 miles from their home. She immediately went to the duplex on Harvard Street, where the gathering had reportedly taken place. The tenant, Susan, was not home, and another woman who answered the door claimed that no party had ever taken place. However, she promised that Susan would call Dorothy. When Susan finally got in touch, she denied seeing Kurt and insisted no party had occurred. However, a pizza delivery man confronted by the Sovas confirmed that a party had indeed taken place that Friday night. Pressed again, and with this new knowledge, Susan finally admitted there had been a gathering and that Kurt had been there. More than a dozen people had stopped by, most older than Kurt, and many were strangers to him. According to Susan, Kurt had been drinking Everclear, an extremely strong liquor. Notably, his friends would later say that Kurt didn't have much of a history of drinking. Sam later explained that Kurt had grown clumsy and ill as the night wore on. Susan asked Sam to take Kurt outside for some air. Around 9:30 p.m., Sam led Kurt out the front door, then briefly went back inside to grab his jacket. When Sam returned, Kurt, who had been leaning against a fence, was gone. Sam searched the streets but found nothing, assuming Kurt had decided to walk home. On Monday, October 26th, two unsettling events occurred. First, a friend of Kurt's named David claimed to have seen Kurt walking with another boy less than a mile from the Sova home. As David pulled over to offer a ride, a van approached. Kurt shouted, "Franco," and both boys jumped into the van. David had no idea Kurt was missing at the time. Had he known, he might have followed that van. 2 days later, Kurt would be found dead. Also on Monday, a strange man appeared in the Sova's neighborhood. He entered a local record store, saw Kurt's missing person flyer, and made a very odd statement. "You might as well take it down. They're going to find him dead in 2 days. Nobody's going to know why he died." The next morning, before the store opened, the manager found flowers and a threatening note left by the stranger. "Roses are red, the sky is blue. They found him dead, and they'll find you too." Terrified, she informed the police. They questioned the man, describing him as a quote-unquote crazy person from Detroit, and then released him. Since Kurt was still just considered missing at that time, there was no basis to hold him. After Kurt's body surfaced, the police attempted to track down the individual, but he had disappeared. But trust me, this story gets much weirder still. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, October 28th, around 3:30 a.m., Susan phoned Dorothy. She claimed someone was sleeping in her basement and suggested it might be Kurt. Although Susan had previously lied, Dorothy and Ken felt they had no choice but to investigate. Ken went to the duplex and searched the basement. He found a cot that had clearly been slept in, yet there was no one there. Ken couldn't say for sure if Kurt had ever slept on that cot, but he believed someone had. Dorothy later suspected that Kurt might have been alive, or perhaps dead or dying on that cot. She theorized that partygoers could have panicked and later dumped his body in a nearby ravine. Just hours after Susan's troubling call, on Wednesday, October 28th, three young boys made a chilling discovery. In a shallow ravine behind a warehouse on Harvard Street, about 500 yards from the duplex, they found Kurt's body lying face up in a small puddle. Apart from minor scratches and bruises, he bore no obvious signs of injury. One of his tennis shoes was lodged in a pile of rocks about 12 feet away, and the other shoe was missing entirely. The authorities confirmed it was Kurt within hours. An autopsy revealed he had died roughly 24 to 36 hours before being found. This meant he had likely survived for at least 3 days after he first vanished, yet he had been missing for a total of 5 days. The coroner's office could not determine a definitive cause of death. Kurt had not been beaten, had no lethal injuries, no fatal blood alcohol level, no hard substances in his system, and no pre-existing conditions. It was officially ruled probable accidental, though the exact cause remained unknown. Dorothy and Ken struggled to accept that the coroner's office could not provide a clear cause of death. As the shock faded, Dorothy began piecing together the bizarre events of those missing days. She and Ken both agreed that Kurt's body had not been in the ravine just 24 hours earlier. Ken had searched the area himself and would have noticed Kurt's bright yellow t-shirt. This strongly suggested that someone had placed Kurt's body there shortly before it was discovered. So, Kurt Sova's story is one of the cases that inspired me to get into unsolved mysteries, and I would really like to see a definitive resolution to this one day. Sadly, Kurt's parents have since passed away, but his brother Kevin remains committed to keeping his memory alive and his case in people's minds. If you have any information about Kurt Sova, please contact the Newburgh Heights Police Department. Hey everyone, quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share the video. Or, hey, if you dislike it, there's a button for that too. I'm not your boss. Now let's get back to business. Lame Johnny, born Cornelius Donahue around 1850 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, led a life of an Old West outlaw. He attended Girard College, an institution for impoverished and orphaned boys, from 1862 to 1872, where he excelled academically and in conduct. Despite this foundation, Donahue's ventures into legitimate professions faltered, leading him into a life of crime. After an unsuccessful stint as a cowboy in Texas, Donahue moved to the Black Hills in 1876, drawn by the gold rush. Also, as a quick aside, during his time in Texas, there were rumors that he engaged in cattle rustling, as was quite common at the time. Keep this in mind, because it'll be important. He prospected along Castle Creek and briefly served as a deputy in Custer County and as a bookkeeper for the Homestake Mining Company. However, his past caught up with him when a Texan recognized him as a horse thief, resulting in his dismissal. Subsequently, Donahue, now known as Lame Johnny due to a pronounced limp, formed a gang that engaged in horse theft, cattle rustling, and stagecoach robberies. Also, yeah, that's just about the most stereotypical resume for a Wild West outlaw, isn't it? The most infamous crime attributed to Lame Johnny's gang occurred on September 26th, 1878. They ambushed the Monitor, an armored stagecoach transporting valuables from the Homestake mine at Canyon Springs Station. The gang secured approximately $3,500 in cash, $500 in diamonds, and 700 pounds of gold dust, nuggets, and bullion. And to give you some sense of just how big this score was for Lame Johnny's crew, 700 pounds of gold today is worth just shy of $30 million. dollars. This heist significantly impacted the region, prompting intense efforts to apprehend the culprits and recover the stolen goods. In July 1879, authorities captured Lame Johnny near the Pine Ridge Reservation. While transporting him to Deadwood for trial, a masked vigilante mob intercepted the stagecoach near Buffalo Gap in the Dakota Territory. They demanded to know the location of the hidden treasure. When Johnny's responses proved unsatisfactory, the mob forcibly removed him from the coach and hanged him from a nearby elm tree, leaving his body shackled. The legend of Lame Johnny's lost treasure persists, with many believing that a portion of the stolen gold remains hidden in the Black Hills. Despite various searches over the years, the exact location of the treasure has never been discovered, leaving it an enduring mystery and a tantalizing lure for treasure hunters. Also, just to add in my own personal thoughts on this one, I'm not quite sure how this hasn't ever been made into a movie or a limited series. And yeah, of course, the real mystery here is how a guy named Cornelius ends up getting nicknamed Johnny. The Plague of Athens, which broke out during the second year of the Peloponnesian War in 429 BC, stands as one of the most devastating epidemics to hit the ancient Greek world. It emerged in a city already under tremendous strain from a protracted conflict with Sparta, and it proceeded to kill a substantial portion of the Athenian population. As the disease ran rampant through the overcrowded city, it not only shattered the social fabric of Athens, but also dealt a crippling blow to the city's military and political fortunes. Prior to the outbreak, Athens and Sparta had been locked in a bitter struggle, with Athens relying on its naval power and the security of its fortified city walls to fend off Spartan land forces. With the countryside left abandoned so that the population could take refuge behind the city's walls, Athens had become extremely densely crowded. Poor sanitary conditions, coupled with the influx of refugees, created an ideal breeding ground for disease. It's not surprising that when the plague struck, it spread rapidly. Simply put, the city of Athens was a tinderbox, and the plague was the match that set it all ablaze. The timing was disastrous. The Athenians were banking on their strong naval presence to supply the city, so the Spartan army's ravaging of the surrounding farmland didn't force a capitulation. Yet instead of famine or enemy swords, a microscopic foe made the city buckle. Thucydides, the great Athenian general and historian, documented the plague extensively in his work, History of the Peloponnesian War. He didn't just record political and military developments, he also carefully described the symptoms and social consequences of the outbreak. Many historians and physicians have turned to Thucydides' account in an attempt to identify the plague's exact cause. According to him, victims suffered sudden severe fever, redness and inflammation of the eyes, and a bloody throat and tongue. They developed foul breath, violent sneezing and coughing, followed by chest pain and severe gastrointestinal problems. Thucydides noted that those who survived often lost their fingers, toes, or eyesight, and became immune if exposed again. Such detailed observations, while invaluable, haven't provided a definitive answer for what this plague actually was. Over the centuries, suggestions have ranged from typhus to typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, or even hemorrhagic fever. Modern DNA analysis has helped narrow some possibilities. In 1994, excavations of a mass grave in a cemetery in Athens uncovered teeth that were tested for pathogens. Scholars thought they had found genetic evidence pointing to typhoid fever, but subsequent analysis led to controversy, and no unanimous conclusion has been reached. The debate continues, reflecting just how challenging it can be to retroactively diagnose an ancient disease based on historical descriptions and incomplete archaeological evidence. Still, the leading hypothesis for many researchers remains typhoid fever, which is consistent with Thucydides' descriptions, especially given the sanitary conditions in besieged Athens. What isn't in doubt is the scale of the disaster. Estimates vary, but it's believed that the plague killed anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the city's population. This had profound social and political repercussions. Athens at the time relied heavily on its navy and on its democratic institutions. With so many citizens and rowers either dead or weakened, not only did the city's military capabilities suffer, but public morale plummeted. Ancient sources recount the breakdown of traditional religious and social norms. Many Athenians believed their gods had abandoned them, while according to Thucydides, others used the chaos as an opportunity to plunder and pursue personal gain. One of the most notable casualties of the plague was the great statesman Pericles. Under his leadership, Athens had flourished, building monumental structures like the Parthenon and achieving a golden age of philosophy, drama, and democracy. Pericles was also the architect of Athens' grand strategy in the Peloponnesian War. He chose to bring the countryside's inhabitants into the city and let Sparta ravage the land, rather than engage directly in a land battle that played to Spartan strengths. While this strategy may have been sound in purely military terms, it inadvertently created the conditions that facilitated the spread of the plague. His death not only deprived the city of a visionary leader, but also thrust Athens into a leadership crisis. Subsequent leaders couldn't match Pericles' prestige or political skill, and the city's policy became more erratic, contributing to internal divisions and ill-fated military ventures. The psychological toll was also immense. Thucydides described an atmosphere of fear and fatalism, as many believed death was inevitable once symptoms appeared. Funeral rites became impossible to carry out as usual, and bodies were thrown onto pyres or left unburied in many cases. Notably, traditional Greek religion centered on proper burial rites to honor the dead and maintain favor with the gods. The inability to perform these rites shook people's faith and cultural identity, leaving them feeling untethered from the values and rituals that had long defined their community. In terms of historical significance, the plague of Athens can't be overlooked as a turning point in the Peloponnesian War. Initially, Athens had enjoyed a strategic advantage. Its walls and navy provided security and allowed for a focus on maritime power. However, after the plague, the morale and manpower of the city were severely diminished. Although the war dragged on for decades after, Athens never fully recovered the confidence and cohesion it had shown in the war's early years. The plague of Athens also contributed to a change in ethical thinking at the time. Athens was, as you may know, a great intellectual and cultural center of the ancient world. Faced with mass mortality and the breakdown of norms, people began to question the justness of the gods and the reliability of traditional moral codes. Thucydides noted a collapse of law and order as those who believed they had little time left tried to enjoy every pleasure before succumbing to illness. This crisis of faith and ethics paved the way for philosophical inquiries that would dominate Greek thought for centuries to come. The Sophists, for instance, emerged with skepticism toward traditional values, and, in turn, thinkers like Socrates grappled with defining virtue in a world where conventional morality seemed to fail so easily. The Burger Chef slayings remain one of the most haunting and perplexing unsolved homicide cases in Indiana's history. In November 1978, four young employees disappeared from a Burger Chef fast food restaurant in Speedway, a small suburban town just outside Indianapolis. Despite extensive investigations and recurring attempts to identify and prosecute the killers, law enforcement agencies never managed to bring the perpetrators to justice. The story began on the evening of November 17th, 1978, when four Burger Chef employees vanished from the restaurant. The victims were 20-year-old assistant manager Jane Freet, 17-year-old Ruth Shelton, and two 16-year-olds, Daniel Davis and Mark Flemons. And I'm going to mention something now, which may seem unusual, but keep this in mind because it'll likely lead to you being increasingly pissed off. These were hard-working young people with no criminal records or any accusations of theft or dishonesty ever. Keep this in mind. That night, the Burger Chef location closed as usual, but when a fellow employee arrived later, the place was deserted. The back door was left open, personal belongings were scattered in odd places, and a relatively small amount of cash, later found to be $581, was missing from the safe. Initially, the Speedway Police Department assumed the situation was a case of petty theft, and that the missing staff members had simply run off with the money. This crucial early misinterpretation led the authorities to delay treating the scene as a crime scene. In those critical early hours, the restaurant was cleaned and reopened the following day, effectively destroying potential physical evidence that could have guided the investigation. 2 days later, on November 19th, hikers discovered the bodies of all four missing employees in a remote wooded area near Johnson County, roughly 20 miles from the restaurant. The way the victims were killed only deepened the mystery. Ruth Shelton and Daniel Davis had been shot execution-style multiple times with a .38 caliber weapon. Jane Freet had been stabbed twice in the chest. Mark Flemons had suffered a blunt force injury to the head. The sheer brutality and seemingly senseless nature of the slayings shocked the community. Investigators theorized that what began as a simple robbery turned into a kidnapping and quadruple slaying when the perpetrators realized they could be identified by their victims. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, local and state law enforcement, assisted by the FBI, mobilized in one of the largest manhunts central Indiana had ever seen. Yet, despite the urgency, key missteps had already hampered the investigation. Because the crime scene at the Burger Chef had not been preserved or treated as a potential serious crime scene, critical forensic evidence was almost certainly lost. Police at first had confidence they could solve the crime quickly, but the lack of physical evidence and reliable eyewitness accounts presented significant hurdles. In my view, the brutal Burger Chef slayings won't ever see a proper resolution. Too much time has passed, and investigators blew their best shot in those critical early hours. Much of the key evidence was basically cleaned up and tossed in the dumpster the morning after the kidnapping. This was based on the theory that four teenagers with no criminal records or any apparent history of accusations of theft all colluded to steal a relatively minor sum of money. We're looking at a decades-old tragedy that was mishandled from the start, and there's no undoing that now. Authorities could ramp up new investigations, tap the latest forensic tech, roll out fresh appeals to the public, and hope someone coughs up a memory they've kept bottled for 40 years. But given the fundamental gaps created when investigators were still reading this situation as a teen heist gone wrong, there's simply no solid foundation to build on. The truth likely won't ever be confirmed in a court of law or anywhere else. Instead, this will remain a painful mystery, defined not only by cruelty, but also by the early missteps that squandered the best chance at justice. And yeah, as you might be able to tell, this case really pisses me off since the police stereotyping four hardworking teens as petty criminals allowed the perpetrator or perpetrators to live free. On April 18, 1961, Joe Simonton, a chicken farmer from Eagle River, Wisconsin, claimed he had a close encounter that involved not just meeting extraterrestrials, but also being served pancakes by them. According to Simonton, at approximately 11 a.m., he witnessed an unidentified flying object descending onto his property. The craft was described as silvery, resembling two inverted bowls stacked together with exhaust pipes along the edge. Intrigued by the craft, Simonton approached it and was greeted by three beings. These creatures, about 5 feet tall, wore dark, tight-fitting clothing, including helmets. What struck Simonton as particularly odd was their apparent human-like features. He described them as looking quote-unquote Italian, with olive skin and dark hair. Despite the surreal situation, the interaction between Simonton and the extraterrestrials seemed surprisingly mundane. One of the beings handed him a metallic container, gesturing that they needed water. Simonton, being a good host, filled the container and returned it to his alien guests. When Simonton handed over the water, one of the aliens began cooking on a flameless grill inside the craft. To his astonishment, the extraterrestrial handed him 3 pancakes. Later, these pancakes were sent for analysis by the United States Air Force as part of a broader investigation. The tests revealed that the pancakes were made from ordinary ingredients. The incident was ultimately labeled as unexplained by J. Allen Hynek, who investigated the case as part of Project Blue Book. Simonton's account quickly garnered media attention, and his story became one of the most unusual in UFO lore. While many reports focused on the bizarre nature of aliens serving pancakes, Simonton himself remained consistent in his narrative, despite the skepticism he faced. Interestingly, he kept one of the pancakes as a souvenir, which was later subjected to more scrutiny by scientists. And if you want to see what sort of pancakes aliens can make, you'll want to look on your screen right about now. Beyond the pancake analysis, investigators noted that Simonton appeared sincere even if the overall scenario seemed implausible. Hynek, who had visited Simonton personally, noted that the farmer seemed genuinely convinced of the encounter's authenticity, though Hynek himself stopped short of offering any specific conclusions. Peter Ivers was a gifted musician, songwriter, and television host, and was a central figure in the emerging Los Angeles new wave scene of the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was best known as the host of New Wave Theater, a cutting-edge music and performance show that aired locally and then nationally via the USA Network's late-night series, Night Flight. Ivers championed underground artists and visionary filmmakers, forging connections that brought him into contact with some of the most innovative creative minds of his time. Yet despite his influence, the nightmarish violence that ended his life on March 3, 1983, in a downtown Los Angeles loft, has never been fully explained. Ivers was born on September 20th, 1946, in Boston, Massachusetts. An intellectually curious and musically gifted child, he excelled at Harvard University, where he explored a variety of creative musical and film-related endeavors. After graduating, he found himself at the intersection of music, film, and television production, gradually making a name within the close-knit creative scenes of both coasts. In the mid-1970s, he befriended rising filmmaker David Lynch, eventually contributing tracks to Lynch's landmark 1977 film Eraserhead. By the late 1970s, Ivers' presence in Los Angeles was notable. He'd introduce obscure bands, challenge viewers with strange and insightful monologues, and engage with the audience in a manner that felt remarkably ahead of its time, according to contemporaries. The show's format, short, frenetic, and stylistically daring, anticipated the coming MTV revolution by presenting music less as a polished product and more as a raw, creative explosion. It was therefore a tremendous shock when, on the morning of March 3rd, 1983, Peter Ivers was found bludgeoned to death in his Los Angeles loft. The scene was gruesome and chaotic. According to later accounts, friends, alarmed when Ivers failed to show up for a meeting, arrived at his residence in the city's gritty downtown area. One of those who discovered his body was film producer Lucy Fisher, who had come by that morning and made the horrifying discovery, along with other concerned colleagues. The loft, located near LA's notorious Skid Row, was not secured by the police immediately. In the hours after the killing, numerous people, including acquaintances, came and went through the crime scene before it was sealed, potentially contaminating evidence. This made a clean investigative process all but impossible. This initial mishandling of the crime scene was a major factor in the subsequent lack of progress in the case. The LAPD had difficulty reconstructing the final hours of Ivers's life and identifying suspects. Over the years, various theories emerged, ranging from a possible burglary gone wrong to more personal motives tied to the entertainment community or those in Ivers's orbit. Perhaps the most prominent theory is that a Canadian associate of the Rolling Stones named David Jove was somehow involved. Jove had allegedly been involved in dealing substances, and some have speculated that this led to a conflict. Personally, in my review of the evidence on this case, there seems like no reason to support that he was involved in the slaying whatsoever. Simply put, he was a shady guy who had some association with Ivers, and the rumor mill did the rest of the work. At any rate, the police never filed charges against anyone, and no solid leads that the public is aware of ever coalesced into an arrest. The personal nature of the killing, death by blunt force trauma, likely with a hammer, initially led some to suspect it might have been someone close to Ivers. There have been periodic calls over the years for the LAPD to reinvestigate the case, applying modern forensic methods to whatever evidence might remain. However, without a new witness coming forward, or a surprising bit of overlooked evidence surfacing, solving the crime seems less and less likely.